Let's continue exploring the universe within art and the art within games. I'm your host, OmLedu, and this is going to be a beginner's guide to Minion Masters. I'll be touching on all of the different masters and then go over some basic deck building tips, and then I'll talk about some of the leaderboard decks and explain how they're constructed and why they work. And I am really not the best at this game, but I'm also not the worst, so this will be do as I say, not as I do. If you want to have tips from a really seasoned player, go check out Bad as a Fish. I will link that in the video description and here on the screen. He is a really knowledgeable guy. But the first thing to keep in mind is there is a difference between solo and teamers. Some masters are better at solo and others are better at teamers, and deck construction will vary slightly as well. But when you're first starting off and learning the game, it's also nice to have a master that is easy to use. Such as the Stormbringer or Mordar, things that don't have very complex special abilities, like King Puff. King Puff is really, really good, but only once you kind of know what you're doing. And you can either build your deck around a certain master, or you can build your deck first and pick a master that fits the deck the best. Like Stormbringer only gives bonuses to ranged units, so maybe you realize your deck has a bunch of ranged units and it would fit Stormbringer, or maybe you build a ranged unit deck around him. Whereas Valko will give your units rage, will help you control the bridges, and then at perk 3 will buff your melee units. So maybe you want to use a bunch of melee units, or you have cards that trigger when your minions have rage. Either way, Valko is another master that is easy for the new player to learn. And his Burn the Bridge perk will help you get used to activating spells at the correct time without having to actually aim the spell. Now Mordar is one of those that is better in teamers rather than solos, because his abilities allow him to resurrect minions, so you kind of want to use lots of big minions to get the most value out of his abilities. Whereas Ratbow is more suited for playing gigantic hordes. You want tons and tons and tons of minions everywhere to try to overwhelm through numbers rather than size. And since he summons Scrats, he goes really good with the Scrat faction. And so really, Ratbow is highly specialized. Now King Puff is one of the best masters in the game, but he's also one of the hardest to learn. He can switch the bridges to give you better positioning or bridge control, but if you use it at the wrong time, you could actually give your opponent better positioning and bridge control. And so he is really, really good, but maybe not for the new player. But this next master, Apep, is really, really good for the new player. You can build any deck around him, he doesn't give abilities to any specific cards, and he gives you free cards to use so you can learn new cards that aren't even in your deck. But Milloween, on the other hand, is a very specialized master. Her decks are totally unique because she needs spells in order to trigger her abilities. She is one of the top masters, but her decks are just so unique, consisting of tons of spells, that it's not really new player friendly. Alternatively, Diona is not very specialized. You can basically build any deck around her, but she's also not very new player friendly because you have to know where and when to activate her traps to get the most value. Plus, you have to learn how and when to protect her pet in order to gain those bonuses. Now, Valorian is good for the new player. He's not very specialized, but I will say that some minions benefit from healing more than other minions. But he can really get you used to using spells in the correct place, because he adds 2 spells to your deck that you have to time correctly and place correctly. Similarly, Tronvir has a bunch of different spells that even kind of act like buildings because they stick around on the field and take some damage. But because he does so many different things, he's not very new player friendly. However, his abilities are the most versatile out of all of the masters, so he is really good in teamers. But Ravager, on the other hand, is the least versatile. He summons a big dude 2 times throughout the game, and you basically want to win during those times. So he's super aggressive. You want to play a super aggressive deck if you use Ravager. So he's highly, highly specialized. Like if you don't win during your big guy pushes, he basically has no abilities except making your minions a little bit faster. Now Setsu, on the other hand, is very versatile and also easy to use and really good. Basically she enters the battlefield herself to go fight the other minions. She can also take out buildings or deal damage directly to the opposing masters for aggro decks. The Master R3KT will also enter the battlefield, but he always starts off next to your tower, so he's more supportive than aggressive. He also isn't specialized, so you can use any deck, and he's fairly easy to use, basically providing support to both bridges for bridge control, defense, or offense. And last, but certainly not least, we have Morelia. She is really, really cool. I would love to use this master. She does a bunch of different stuff, but basically you want to hit perk 3 and summon her dragon. And so I would typically build her with a more control-oriented deck where you're trying to control the bridges and wait until perk 3. But because her abilities have a bunch of variation and you're trying to play control, I wouldn't necessarily recommend her for the new player. So really, all in all, it's up to how you want to play, especially once you get a good feel for the game. You know, if you want to specialize, like go hyper aggressive with the Ravager, or if you want to learn one of the more complicated characters right off the bat, you know, more power to you. But I would recommend for the new player who's trying to get a feel for the game, you know, avoid some of the complicated characters like Milloween and choose like Apep, Valorian, Setsu, Stormbringer, Valko, or Ravager. You know, all 6 of those are very easy to use, which will make it easier for you to learn the basics of the game. Whereas with like Milloween or Mordar, especially the new player can get too distracted in their abilities and trying to make use of them, and it might end up messing up your basic deck construction. And then that can make it even more difficult to learn the game, you know, which is what we will talk about now, is basic deck construction. So a deck consists of 10 cards and 1 master. Again, you can either start off by choosing your master and building a deck to fit your master, or you can start off by building a deck and then figuring out which master will be best for that deck. But if you're not even sure what type of deck or what specialization you want, you know, I would definitely recommend Apep, Valorian, or Setsu, because you can literally build any sort of deck based around them. But you know, Ravager, Stormbringer, and Valko are also super duper easy to use. You know, just keep in mind what your master's bonuses are so that you can, you know, fit your deck to those bonuses. Like how Stormbringer will give your ranged minions a bonus, you know, so with Stormbringer you would want more ranged minions in order to make use of his bonuses. You know, but really, whether you want to pick your master first or pick your cards first, it is all up to you. And then there's also factions. Each faction has a special ability that kind of works within the cards in that faction. Now, this doesn't mean that you can only have cards from one faction in your deck. In fact, most of the time, most decks have cards from a bunch of different factions. You know, but some masters even, like Ratbow, go better with certain factions. You know, like he goes good with Scrats and Scrat Hordes because one of the special abilities of Scrats depends on how many Scrats you have in play. You know, or like Stoutheart is just like big bulky dudes who want to be played next to each other. You know, so Ratbow probably wouldn't go good with Stoutheart. And not even every card in the faction will have the faction abilities. And so even though you can get synergy from building a faction deck, it's not always the best idea. But it's also not the worst. Again, really it depends on your master, and it depends on how you're trying to play. But no matter what master or style of deck you're trying to play, there are some basic ground rules. The first of which is bridge control. You're going to need at least 2 cards that are cheap and can capture both bridges. Bridge control is one of the most important features in this game. You know, because that's how you get bonus experience, and if you get behind in experience, not only are you missing out on your master's abilities, but your opponent is going to win when they hit Mana Frenzy first. So you want cheap dudes, preferably packs of dudes, so that you can play them in the middle of your field, and they will walk to each bridge, so you can capture both bridges with 1 card. And again, you want at least 2 of these cards that can easily capture bridges. And the next fundamental is spells. You want at least 2 spells that can kill things. You know, spells that do damage. These will allow you to take out snipers or to take out counters before they actually reach your minions. You know, they will help you control the bridges, and they will help you deal damage to the masters. You know, you need at least 2 kill spells in order to control what's going on in the game. You know, but I will say if you have more than 2 spells, they can end up clogging up your hand, because it's always a good idea to hold your spells until the perfect opportunity presents itself. And then also, the different types of spells will really depend on the rest of your deck. You know, do you need to kill hordes with like the Daggerfall? Do you need to kill tons of ground with like the Bear Avalanche? You know, or do you need to stun minions, you know, to give you a little extra push when you're, you know, smashing on the opponent's master tower? And so this really depends on the rest of your deck and your win condition. And that's another thing that's really important to figure out is what is your win condition? You know, are you playing a giant dude and trying to push him all the way to your opponent's tower? Are you playing super aggressively with tons of cheap hordes and rammers and things that target buildings? Are you trying to stall until you get enough experience on your master to win with their abilities? That's a really important thing to keep in mind, is what is your win condition? And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the balance of your deck. Now, your deck is going to need answers for flying, hordes, tanks, and snipers. So like in this example, we have tons and tons of really big melee units. But we don't have really any ranged units. The only ranged unit that we have is the little crossbow dudes. So if they had flying monsters, we don't really have any answer for that other than the crossbow dudes and the chain lightning. So it's good to keep these things in mind, like what are your answers for flying? Because you're going to need ranged minions who can actually shoot flyers. Or what are your answers for horde? You need some AoE damage like explosions, or for tanks, you need to be able to stun them or deal high damage really quickly. Or for snipers, you're basically going to need spells, to snipe the snipers. And some minions are good at multiple things. Some are good at killing flyers and at killing hordes. But adversely, some cards are able to counter the counters. So like one answer for a big minion is to overwhelm it with a horde, but a card like the Colossus can deal AoE damage to wipe out the horde. And so as you play, you'll get more and more used to the checks and balances. But as for your win condition, maybe you're trying to be super aggressive with like Ravager, having minions that just attack buildings so that they run past other minions and try to deal as much damage as they can. Or maybe you're trying to play more defensive and controlling, trying to get an experience advantage so that you win through Mana Frenzy or through your Master's ultimate perk, like with Morelia's Dragon. And this is important to keep in mind for synergy. If you're trying to play super aggressively, well, you need aggressive cards that can deal damage really quickly and overwhelm your opponent. Whereas if you're trying to win through experience, well, then you need extra bridge control and you need answers to things. You need to always have an answer for what your opponent is trying to do so that you can stall out until you get Mana Frenzy or an experience advantage. Or rather than just being focused on aggression or defense, you can be somewhere in the middle and focus around a high cost card. Like the Ice Dragon or like one of the Zen Chi Titans. All of these can be win conditions all on their own. Like the High Marshal Rystar can even give you a direction for your deck by turning Legionaries into Centurions. So when it comes to picking a direction for your deck, just try to keep synergies in mind. You can either build around a high cost card, build around a master, or a playstyle, like aggression or defense, or you could even build around a faction. But regardless, basically all decks will need some of the same fundamentals. Like 2 bridge captures, 2 damage spells, an answer for flying, horde, tanks and snipers, and a win condition. So for this example, we're going to use the Colossus as our win condition. Now the Colossus can attack hordes of ground units, so maybe now we need some flying control, because the Colossus cannot attack flyers. So already we have a little bit of horde control because the Colossus can take out hordes, but he is really expensive, so we need another way to take out hordes as well. And since the Annihilator has AoE damage, he can take out hordes as well as shoot flyers. Then we have another ranged minion for extra flying control, and then some flying minions of our own. So these 3 seem like pretty good support for the Colossus. And since we picked 3 cards that belong to the same faction, let's take a look at the other Outlander cards in that faction to see if there's any bonuses that we can utilize. It's always nice to pick up a little more synergy, and sure enough, we have this card that has Outlander Tech, that's the Outlanders faction's special ability, and it looks like it'll go better than the version of it that we already have. It's only 1 mana more, and since we can use Outlander Tech, we can make use of its bonuses. And since we decided to utilize Outlander Tech, let's switch out the crossbow dudes for some Plasma Marines. The Marines will still allow us to take bridges, but they're also Outlander cards, so they'll add to the Outlander Tech. But now let's try to figure out what else this deck needs. So we have 4 ranged attackers, 2 AoE damage, so it looks like we have flying and hordes under control. Maybe what we need is extra ground support. So let's do this drone, because it's really good at attacking ground units, and since we have a bunch of ranged units, hopefully we'll be able to protect it a little bit better, from their flying or from their range. But now our average mana is getting a little high. You kind of want to keep your average mana in between 3.5 and 4.5. If your average mana is too low, your cards tend to be underwhelming, but you will be able to cycle your deck quickly to play the same card multiple times. Whereas if your average mana is too high, you just won't be able to play enough cards, and you'll end up getting overwhelmed by your opponent. But a good aiming point is 3.7 to like 4.2. And for solos, like 1v1s, you want a lower mana curve so that you can play cards more often to answer what your opponent is doing. Or if you're trying to cycle your deck quickly to play the same card multiple times, you also want a lower mana curve. But in 2v2 teamers, you tend to want a slightly higher mana curve, like 4.0 or 4.2, because there's more minions being played, so you tend to want to be slightly more bulky. Plus, you have a friend who should be helping you control the bridges with low-cost cards and things like that. And your master can also influence your average mana cost. Like Apep gives you free cards to play throughout the game, so he's a little more forgiving if your mana curve is a little too high. And I think 4.4 is a little too high, but we're just going to run with it and we're going to play a few practice games just to test it out. It's always good to test out your decks first, to try out your mana curve, to see what you like and what you don't like, or to see if you might have overlooked something. And if you're still struggling to make decent decks, you can always check out the leaderboards to get some deck ideas. But it's always important to look at what master is being used with the deck, because Milloween's going to use more spells, where Stormbringer is going to use more range. But let me find a nice balanced Apep deck so I can kind of explain how the deck is constructed. So again, here we have 2 bridge control cards, we have the little monkey, and we have a Scrat Pack. Then they have 3 damaging spells, mainly for Jin Long, because he triggers off of you using spells, so they're using 3 instead of 2. Then they have the Storm Tamer to take out big tank units. Then they have some bulk with the Woodsman, some AoE with the Caber Tosser, and then their win condition is the Blue Golem. And then they're using a 2-faction synergy. They have the Xin Chi Growth Burst Shrooms from the Bounceberry Flinger that is powering up the Blue Golem, and then Jin Long as well. Then they also have Stout Heart's Revelry with the Woodsman, being triggered by the Storm Tamer or the Caber Tosser. But again, they have 2 minions to capture bridges, just a Scrat Pack to capture both, and then the Bounceberry Flingers just to have a cheap unit to throw over a bridge. The monkey is also ranged, so he can help out against flying minions, and he can hit 2 minions at once to help out against hordes. But it looks like they have like 5 cards to deal with hordes. They have Daggerfall, they have the monkeys, they have the Frost Feathers, they have Jin Long, and they have the Caber Tosser. All 5 of those have some form of AoE damage. And Jin Long can also stun big scary tank units, to allow the Woodsman to get some good shots in, especially if his Revelry has been triggered by the Storm Tamer or the Caber Tosser. And then the Storm Tamer can also stun big units by lifting them up into the air. So this deck has a lot of answers for hordes, it has some answers for tanks, it has a couple of spells for snipers, like the Daggerfall and the Morgul's Mark, it has bridge capture, 3 ranged minions, and 2 spells to deal with flyers, and they're even utilizing 2 different factions' bonuses. The Xin Chi's Growth Burst Shrooms, and the Stout Heart's Revelry. Plus having a Blue Golem pick up a Growth Burst Shroom as their win condition. But now let's take a look at this bottom Apep deck. So again, they're using the Bounceberry Flingers with the Blue Golem for that Xin Chi synergy and as a win condition. Then they have their 2 damaging spells, Daggerfall for hordes, and then the Blast Crystal for hordes and for slightly larger control like snipers. Then for their bridge control, they have the monkeys and the Lone Scout, just super duper cheap minions to throw across the bridge, but they're not using packs of minions, which is really interesting. And on top of the Xin Chi faction's abilities, it also looks like they're using a little bit of the Slither faction abilities. And even though they don't have any pack units to capture both bridges, their mana curve is fairly low, so they have like 4 different cheap units that they can throw over the bridges. Then they also have the Blue Golem as their win condition, with the Bounceberry Flinger and the Growth Burst Shrooms. Now I also think they nerfed the Growth Burst Shrooms since I recorded this, so that might not be quite as an effective win condition anymore. But then their spells are mainly for hordes. They have the Snake Druid to freeze single units or aggressive units. They also have the Assassin to sneak up on snipers or big units or medium units, as well as the Imp that has AoE damage. The Curse Bearer, which is really good for cursing really large units. So it looks like they're really, really strong against singular big units. So they're trying to prevent other golems from getting them, and then getting the opponent with their own golem. And they have 3 ranged minions and 2 spells to deal with flyers. But if we go to teamers, we can see that the decks are going to be a little bit more expensive, but they still follow the same general rules. They each have 2 to 3 damaging spells to control what's going on. They each have 2 to 3 cheap minions to throw across the bridges for bridge control, like Scrat Pack or just a cheap dude to throw across. Now AoE is a lot more valuable in teamers, like Fergus or the Beam of Doom. Since you have 2 players constantly gaining mana and constantly playing minions, AoE is a lot more valuable in teamers. So you're going to see a lot more Whirly Scrats and Grenaders, Ferguses and Beams and Balls and anything that deals multiple damage to a big group of dudes. Because in teamers, there's going to be a ton of mana on the field at any given time. So always keep in mind what game mode you're building your deck for, if you're building it for 1v1s or 2v2s. And check the leaderboards occasionally just to see what all is being played, look at new combos that you might not have thought about, or even just copy a deck off of here and try to use it for yourself. So much of this game is learning what all of the different minions do, learning how to counter those minions, and learning where on the field to play cards. So it's always good to practice and it's always good to experiment. The more cards that you use, the more that you will learn about them. And before you know it, you might end up on the leaderboards yourself. The more you play, the more you'll learn. The more you learn, the better you'll get. So every time you build a new deck, especially, just go practice it. You might see things that you didn't see when you were building the deck, and you'll learn what to counter with what. It really helps you get a feel for your bridge control and what you're weak against, and what you're strong against. But as for game advice, it's usually best to either fight by your master tower so that your master helps out your minions, or to fight on the bridges so that you can prevent your opponent from gaining control. Because again, especially in upper ranks, a lot of the games are determined by who hits Mana Frenzy first. Bridge control and experience advantage gets more and more important the farther up the ranks that you get. In lower ranks, you'll be able to take advantage of mistakes and counter units in order to win the game. But in upper ranks, countering units really translates to bridge control. So whoever plays the best will end up controlling the bridges for the longest and have the experience advantage. But also remember that your health is a resource. You don't have to stop every unit from attacking you. You can let some units target your tower so that you can blow them away with other units without fearing for their safety. Now also keep in mind that you want to conserve your mana as much as possible. Only use additional mana if the push is guaranteed to really do some damage. Because you need to be able to counter what your opponent does as soon as they play it. But be careful because you don't want to burn mana like I am now. There is a limit to how much mana you can have, so sometimes it's okay to burn a tiny bit of mana. It won't be the end of the game, but in general, you want to try to not waste mana, but not overuse mana either. And the more you play, the better of a feel you'll get for the game, for balancing how much to invest in capturing the bridges, how much to invest in your pushes, or how much to invest in just sitting back and defending. All of these are things that you will learn and get a feel for as you play and progress. Because there will be times that you overinvest in a push, and then a well-placed spell takes out your entire army, and then you're out of mana to defend for this gigantic push that is now coming your way, and you might lose the game. Or other times you might invest too much in your push, and not quite kill them, and then not have enough mana again to defend. Or sometimes you might not push hard enough and try to conserve too much mana, and then you'll lose bridge control and end up losing the experience game in the long run. And so it's just good, especially when starting out, to keep all of these things in mind. To know that bridge control is important. To know that sometimes you need to abandon your push because you don't have enough mana to support it. Or knowing when to push to try to get advantage, to try to wipe out their defense, and to try to protect your big guy. All of these things are things that you will learn and get better at the more that you play. And the more that you play with a specific deck, the more you will learn about that deck. So you'll start seeing what you're good against or what you're weak against. Eventually you'll be like, oh man, I just cannot handle big tanks. I need something to stop big tanks. Or I'm really strong against flying, but I'm really weak whenever they just throw aggressive rammers and building crushers at me. So the more that you play, just try to keep an eye out for those things, and you will learn and be able to tweak your deck in order to cover your weaknesses, and boost your strengths. And the last thing I want to talk about is what to spend your resources on. I know this can be kind of confusing if you're new to the game. Basically, always check the daily offers because you can get literally anything in the game for gold from the daily offers. But also check the special offers every day because occasionally there is free stuff in here, like free rubies or free shards, but really you want to buy most things from the daily offers. You can get masters and legendary cards and tokens all at a discount for gold. Now, of course, you can always just buy tokens, and if you do, buy the 10-pack for 9,000, but sometimes you can find tokens in the daily offers, and it will actually be cheaper in the daily offers than it will just buying that 10-pack for 9,000. Now, as for masters, you can buy them for shards and have them forever, and so this is really nice. If there's a master that you want, don't be afraid to use your shards in order to get that master. because you won't see masters quite as often in the daily offers for gold as you will tokens and cards. But you can always craft a card if you're really wanting to use that card. Legendaries are a little expensive at 2,000 shards per card, but all of the other ones are super duper cheap. But I would recommend, being a little conservative with your gold and shards, just in case you come across something that you really, really want. Because the game does a really good job at throwing tokens and gold at you, and you can use those to get the cards that you're looking at. So be a little more conservative with your shards until you're sure that you really want that card and you don't think there's any other way that you can get it. Now, when it comes to promoting a card, don't do this. Don't waste your shards promoting a card unless you have no other cards that you need or want, or you have all the masters and just don't need shards anymore. This will give you a little bit of gold and a little bit more stuff over time, but in general, this is going to be a waste for the new player. So new players, don't promote your cards, it'll be okay. I would also recommend trying to save around 10,000 gold, because sometimes in the daily offers, you can get masters or legendaries, things that you really, really want, and it can be hard to grind, 10,000 gold in a day. So just try to be conservative with your resources, but also don't be afraid to spend them, and do most of your shopping in the daily offers. But that's all we got for this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, share, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and it makes me super happy. Let me know if you have any requests or comments, or you would want to see more Minion Masters content, and I would be more than happy to help you out. But until next time, I've been your host, OmLedu, hopefully teaching you a minion trick or two, and reminding you, as always, don't forget to have fun. Bye-bye.